Okay, today we're going to be speaking about part one of harvesting grain for matzah. When is the right time to harvest that grain? Today we're going to do part one, and Mitzvah Hashem, in the future we're going to do part two of that question. Okay, and excuse me. So before, let me just give a drop of an introduction before we get to the exact points we have to get to, and that is there are rayas from the Gemara and from Rishonim that it is possible for grain to have started to become chametz, even though there's no outward signs of it. The Gemara talks about something called nispaku. The Gemara itself speaks about that nispaku. It doesn't mean actually you could see that the word means cracked. You don't see the crack in it. It means if you do a certain procedure, then you'll see the crack. And there are other rayas like that. That it's possible for a grain, you could pick up the grain, stare it in the face and look at it, and you'll see no signs that it became chametz. And even so, it actually did become chametz, or at least it's a suffix that it became chametz. Okay, so that's sort of like an introduction or a background to the idea that sometimes we will look at things and we won't see the chametz, yet it would be chametz anyhow. Okay, so now let's get to really what we have to talk about, and that is like this. The everything we're going to speak about, excuse me, is going to be working off of, based on, the beginning from Rashba, Tshuva and Rashba, very short Tshuva. And the question the person answers was like this. It's a short question and a short answer. The question was, the Gemara says in Psachim that it's possible for wheat to become chametz even though it's still attached to the ground. It was achametz b'mechuber. It could become attached. It could become chametz when it's attached to the ground. So the person answers the question. He says, if it's possible for wheat to become chametz when attached to the ground, meaning if it got rained on, well, it rains all the time. So how could we ever make matzah out of wheat? Well, it's going to rain at some point when it's growing, and if it can become chametz even when it's attached to the ground, then all wheat should be assumed to be chametz. Then it's sort of automatic that it's going to become chametz. Now, presumably, that question wasn't a question on the Gemara. Because if you live in Bavel, or if you live in Eretz Yisrael, it doesn't rain at the time around that harvesting time, whereas the grain is growing, it only rains at certain times of the year. But whether that's true or not, I don't know. But that was the person's question, is that how is it possible to ever have chametz, to have wheat, if the Gemara says that it could become chametz while it's attached to the ground? And the Rashba gives a very short answer, and he says no, the time it can only become chametz, there's a certain stage when the wheat can become chametz if it gets wet, even if it's attached to the ground. But before that stage, it will not become chametz. I'm going to read you the whole thing because it's very short. He says, Hahi, she'nespashal legamri b'mechuber. The way it could become chametz is when it was nespashal legamri while it was attached. Ve'enet tzricha klal yenika. Doesn't need any more nutrition or attachment to the ground. V'chosin ish yabesh legamri b'mechuber. When it gets to that point where it says yabesh legamri b'mechuber, kaman demancha b'kadidami. It's like sitting in a container, meaning it's as if it's no longer. It was like already harvested. And then, if it would rain on it, it would become chametz. But otherwise, it would not become chametz. Okay, so the Rashba gave us, if you listen carefully, the Rashba gave us three definitions of when it is, three descriptions of what it is, at what stage it is that the grain can become chametz, and that before it wouldn't be. He said it was nispashal gamri, it was einatrich kali yanika, and it was nisyavish legamri. Those are three, and presumably those are all at the same time. He's giving, in all of, 20 words over here, I don't know how many words, he's giving us a description, and he says three different ways of describing of when it is. Presumably those are all at the same time. Okay, so now we have to find out, okay, what was he talking about? What was he describing when he said it reached this stage? This is the stage when it becomes chametz, but before it can't become chametz. And of course, the point being is, we want to harvest our wheat before it hits that stage. Well, either one or the other. Either we have to harvest it before it reaches that stage, so we know it didn't become chametz while attached to the ground. Or the other choice is, we watch and we make sure it doesn't rain. We keep an eye on the keep an eye on the farm, and we say, okay, it reached that stage on Sunday, and when it could become chametz. We're not harvesting until Tuesday, but by Tuesday, we saw it didn't rain on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, then we'd be okay also. Okay, so but we need to understand, when is that cutoff when it could become chametz, and we want to harvest before then, or watch it after that point. Okay, so now, in order to understand this, to probe and figure out what the Rashba was talking about, we're going to have to talk about the stages of the way wheat grows, and I'm going to use the terminology and the formulations that contemporary agronomists use. They have a very, very specific way of describing these things. I'm going to use those just as a way of describing it. The exact same thing happened when the Rashba was growing it and others since then. But we'll use these terms just to help us put our finger on what we're talking about. Okay? And I'm going to use a system called the BBCH system. There's a few different systems. A lot of people use the FEEX, I don't know if that's pronounced it right, correctly, system. We're going to use BBCH because it divides things really neatly and in ways that work well for us. Okay? So this system divides the growth of wheat and other grains into 10 main stages, and those are numbered 0 through 9. Okay, and each stage is then subdivided into subcategories, substages. So, for example, stage zero, that's the very first stage, is called germination. And it goes from 0, which is the dry seed, to 09, which is the emergence, and that means I know I'm not going to pronounce this right, the coleoptile penetrates the soil surface, and which is to say there's like a shield around the plant that starts to poke through the surface before the first leaf comes out. So that when that emerges, when that penetrates the soil surface, it's a cracking growth stage. That's the last stage within 0. So it's called 09. It's in the last stage within germination. Okay, that's for example in the 0 stage. Okay, that's not so important to us. And of course, we're in between stages between 0 and 09. Okay, what most concerns us is stages 7, 8, and 9. 7 is the stage called development of fruit. That means when the grains have been developing. Stage 8 is called ripening, and stage 9 is called senescence. I hope I pronounced that right. Senescence means when it ages and it's slowly a living organism slowly deteriorates and stops having the functionality that it usually have. Okay, so we have development of life, fruit. That's 7. Ripening is 8, and senescence, which is number 9. Now let's go stage 7. Stage 7. There are stages from 71 to 77, and they describe the liquid, the contents within the kernel of wheat. So it goes from being watery ripe, which is, and then an early milk, which is say the liquid. There's a liquid inside of it, and it seems milky. Then it becomes a medium milk, and then eventually becomes a late milk. Okay, the different stages of how milky it is, and you can a farmer can. The farmer can squeeze the grain, and he would see how thick or how viscous it is. The liquid that comes out of it will give him an idea of which stage it's at. This whole stage 7, the development of the fruit, takes 15 to 18 days. Okay, that's stage 7. And you could the farmer will squeeze in depending if what comes out is very liquidy or comes out more like yogurty. That would tell him what stage he's at. Okay, now stage 8. In stage 8, the milk has become thick, that it's more like a dough, and as we progress through the different parts of stage 8, the grain gets harder and harder, and the way you measure how thick. First of all, the inside. We now talk of the content of the grain as being a dough. It's an early dough or a soft dough or a hard dough, but also you measure the thickness of the berry. That's what's called the grain is called the berry, by pressing your fingernail on the outside of the berry. At some point, it makes like no impression on the berry. That's stage 85. Later, it leaves a little impression on the outer skin of the berry. That's 87. And finally, it gets so hard that you can't. At stage 89, you can't even crack the grain if you press your nail into it. Okay, that's how hard it gets. Okay, that's BBCH 89. That's the final stage in ripening, and at that point, it's considered to be fully ripe. Like remember, stage 8 is the ripening. So in stage 7 is just developing, and stage 8 is ripening. So 89, which is the last part of stage 8, it's considered fully ripe, and a farmer would call that physiological maturity. That's how they call it. Now, the grains are still going to change after this. They're not finished. What they look like and how they appear, but they've finished growing as much as they need to on the plant. And what's going to happen after stage 89 in the 9 stages is going to happen is what's mainly going to happen. It's going to dry out. Okay, the berry will dry out from what it had beforehand. But what's significant about the difference between stage 8 and stage 9 is that to get to stage 8, as to progress through stage 8, it needs to be attached to the plant. Being attached to the plant is what helps it, the dough get thicker and the shell get harder, and all the things that I described beforehand about all the different steps as it moves through the different parts of stage 8. But stage 9 does not need to be attached anymore. Those things are just a matter of time. It just takes time for that to happen, and that could just as well happen unattached to the plant as attached to the plant. Okay? Now, another thing to pay attention to is that in the 8s, while it's in the 8, the moisture level, as it's going through the ripening stages in stage 8, the moisture level is dropping. So at the end of stage 85, it's at a 40% moisture. At the end of stage at 87, it'll be a 30% moisture. At the end of 89, it'll be 20 to 25% moisture. Okay, that's as it's moving through those stages. Also, in addition to that, the color of the berry, and we'll see why this is important in a second, the color of the berry and the stalk are changing also. As it moves through the 8s, at 83, the berry will be green. 85, it'll be green, described as being greenish brown. By 87, it'll be brownish gold. And by 89, it'll be golden. Excuse me, that's the berry itself. The stalk, at 83 and 85, it's still green. The stalk is green. But by 89, the I don't know pronounce this right, peduncle, that's the, I think it's the peduncle. It's the part of the stalk just under the head which holds the grain. Okay, so it's the very top of the stalk part of the stalk. It's right underneath the head which is holding the grain. At stage 89, the peduncle is yellow, and the yellowness starts spreading downwards. Later it's going to be completely yellow. Okay, when you think about a wheat stalks, the picture that we often see of them later in their development is they're all yellow. Well, at stage 89, just the peduncle is, I hope I pronounced that right, is yellow, and it's already starting to spread further down. Okay, now that's all in the 8 stages. So at the end of 8, at 89, when we're finished stage 89, we had physiological maturation. The moisture level is 20-25%. The berry is golden, and the stalk is starting to change over from yellow to green. Okay, now when it moves to the 9s, into the 9 stage, the next stage is 92. That's called harvest ripe. The grain is very hard. You can't even dent it when you push your fingernail into it. Okay, and when by the end of stage 92, it's dried down to 13-14% storage, which is the optimal dryness for storage. Okay, it doesn't get drier than that. That's as dry as it can get, and that's the best way to store it at that stage. And that point, it's considered harvest ripe. Okay, so earlier at stage 89, it was just called fully ripe, and it was called physiological maturation. But after stage 92, it's called harvest. That's what it's called at that point, harvest ripe. Okay, I mean, there are stages past 92. 93 and 97, 99, etc. But 92 is considered harvest ripe, and at that point it's at its driest that it's going to be. The berry is golden, like it was, and the stalk is completely yellow to the point that the head may even be bending over. That's how big it's doing. Okay, so now we've heard all this background on how grain grows and the different stages. So, as I mentioned beforehand, the time to harvest grain for wheat for Pesach is before it becomes chametz on the stalk. Okay, we want to do either we want to catch it before it gets to the final stage of development. We want to catch it either at a point when it cannot become chametz, because, like the Rashba says, before a certain point it can't become chametz. Either we want to catch it before that, or we want to watch it from when it crosses that line to where it could become chametz to make sure that no water gets onto it, like it doesn't rain onto it. Okay, now that's what our concern is for harvesting grains. Well, guess what? Farmers have very similar considerations, and that is they want to harvest the grain if the wheat berries, the kernels, if they think, so to speak, that they have been planted, then, like if it rains too much on them the grain will start to think that it was planted. It has to do with rain and temperature, dramatic temperature changes, etc. Then the plant will think that it started. The grain will think that it was planted, even though it's sitting on top of a stalk. It'll think that it was planted, and what will happen is that will degrade the quality of the grain, which is to say is when a farmer brings his wheat to be sold, whoever he brings it to, they measure the starch level of the wheat. And if the starch level is too low, the lower it is, the less money they get for that wheat. So what happened is if the grain will think that it was planted, it will start to release enzymes which will help break down the starches, and the starch will now all of a sudden, it will have lower starch level, which will make it, the farmer will get less for it. So he wants to harvest his grain before that would happen. So he doesn't want it to rain on his grain either at a point that would make it start to think that it was planted, and it would ruin it. So in theory, the farmer would love to harvest his grain at stage 89, at the physiological maturity, because he knows that at that point it doesn't need to be attached to the ground. It doesn't gain anything more from being attached to the ground once it's at that stage. So he would love to harvest it then, meaning because he knows that's the first chance he has to harvest it, and he prevents himself problems, like we want to prevent problems of having rain on it. Now, at that point, the grain is 20-25% moisture, okay, which is not a good storage level. You want to get it to 13.5% to storage. So, but in theory, he would love to harvest it at stage 80, at the end of stage 89, and then dry it some other way. Like if he's in a really dry climate, he'll just leave it on the field to dry. If he's not in that kind of a place, then he'll bring it inside and he'll bring it into his silo and put it through, use fans or heaters to dry it out, in order to dry it out to get it down to the 13.5% that he needs for storage. Okay, now, so that I told you why he would want to harvest it at 89. The problem is that the drier the grains, the berries are, the easier it is for the combine to thresh and harvest them. See, because in I don't know, 1,000 years ago, when people harvested, they harvested the grain, and then they did all the other steps afterwards. Nowadays, the combine, this big machine that drives through the field, not only does it cut the grain off the ground, it also threshes and winnows them. Okay, now, which is of course very important to the farmer. He doesn't want to do that by himself. So the combine works best. The drier the berries are, the better the combine works on them. So from that perspective, he wants to wait. The farmer wants to wait as long as he can to harvest, because he wants his combine to be more efficient. So what happens like this: if the weather forecast seems positive, he's not expecting a lot of rain or wind, and the temperatures are going to stay pretty stable, which means the grains won't think that they're being planted, etc. Then the farmer is going to wait till the harvest until he gets to BBCH 92, which is harvest ripe, when it has the lowest moisture that it's ever going to have, 13-14%. If things don't look so good, things like, let's say it's going to rain or the temperature is not favorable for what he wants to do, then what he'll do is he'll harvest it earlier and suffer with the fact that his combine won't work as well. Okay, now let's move back to the Rashba. Okay, so we know how wheat grows. We've seen how wheat is harvested, or when farmers want to harvest it, and now let's talk about it for ourselves. The Rashba said that there are 3 criteria for knowing when the wheat is at the point that it can become Chimutz. He said it was Nispashal Lagamri, Ein Tzricha Kal Yanika, and Nisyabesh Lagamri. Okay? And of those 3 that I just mentioned, the last 2, Ein Tzricha Kal Yanika and Nisyabesh Lagamri, the Shulchan Aruch brings those 2. The Shulchan Aruch brings this Rashba. He doesn't bring the first one. Okay. So what is he talking about when he says this? So the first one and the third one, Nispashal Lagamri and Nisyabesh Lagamri, sound like, when you first hear them, sounds like BBCH 92. It's got a stage where it's never going to change or ripen or dry it anymore. It's Nispashal Lagamri, it's completely ripened, and Nisyabesh Lagamri, dried out. It's as dry as it's going to be. Okay? That grain, when you look at grain that's at BBCH 92, it's exactly the same as grain that you have from a year ago. It's not going to look any different. It's going to be exactly the same thing. So seemingly, that's what he means like when he says, excuse me, Nispashal Lagamri and Nisyabesh Lagamri. At the same time, what was that middle term he said? It was Ein Tzricha Kal Yanika. That sounds like stage 89, which I told you is called the physiological maturity, because at that point it doesn't need unique anymore. It doesn't need to be attached to the ground anymore. Okay, it'll dry out. This exactly the same. The rest of the development would happen just as well if it wasn't attached to the ground. Actually, what happens is the stalk itself starts dying out. It starts losing its green color. Okay, which tells you that in itself tells you, even if you weren't a farmer last year, you say, hey, looks like this plant isn't doing much anymore. It's not getting anything more from the plant. The plant itself is dying. You could see that the stalk itself is dying out. It's fading away. It's going from green, like healthy growing, to yellow, dried out. So you get that feeling when you look at this. Okay, well, now let's go back and say, maybe Nispashal Gamri might also mean stage 89. Because nisbashal means like to ripen, has to do with things that are onto the ground. But if something could happen when it's also not on the ground, then you could say, well, then maybe that's not even called ripening, because it could happen even when it's not attached to the ground, just as well when it's not attached to the ground. So you could, for that matter, you could say also, maybe you could say this yabish lagamri also means that stage 89, because I'm sorry, it's not so easy to use that, what I'm saying, to say this yabish lagamri, because this yabish lagamri sounds like it's finished drying out. It's as dry as it's going to be. That sounds like 92. It's harder to justify that. Maybe nisbashal lagamri we could say means, stage 89. Harder to say that for nisyabish lagamri. So we're left here with a little bit unclear about what the Rashba mean. Which one does he mean? Does he mean BBCH 89? That's 20-25% moisture. Or does he mean BBCH 92, which is at 13-14% moisture? Okay, and obviously that's a big difference. That in fact those numbers is between at the BBCH 89 or stage 92 is that's the window through in which farmers are going to harvest, and potentially we have to decide when do we want to harvest for our chametz. They won't do it before 89 because also it won't be ripe. It won't have developed enough. They won't do it after 92. There's nothing to gain by waiting for longer than that. So they don't gain anything. So someplace in there is when a farmer wants to do a harvest, and we want to figure out when does the Rashba want us to do our harvest. So let's look at the later poskim to see what do they think the Rashba meant when he described this. So Chayadam and the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch both say that you should harvest grain while the stalks still have some green to them. Okay, the Chayyadim says, while they still have some green to them. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to turn back to my page for a second. Look at this thing here. Okay, now if you wait till stage 92, there's no green left to it. The Kishrich Aruch says also, while it still has some green to it. Okay, both of them, that's what they say. The Aruch HaShulchan, he's not talking about the stalk. The Aruch HaShulchan talks about the kernel, the berry itself, the kernel itself, and he says that you should do that when it is. Don't harvest the berries when they're still fully green. Okay, fully green is like I'm sorry, I got to get back to my other page over here. Sorry about that. Fully green for the green on the berry is like way early stages, like 83 and maybe 80, 85. He says don't do that, because if you do that, it's going to be so moist you won't be able to grind it into flour. Because remember, the inside of the grain then is going to be what's called a soft dough or early dough or a soft dough. It's very hard. It would be very hard to grind it at that point. He says instead, wait until the grains have turned, what he uses the word white, but he means to say is what we would call that yellow, golden color. Okay, and at that point, you should harvest it, but don't wait until it's even drier. Do it when it gets to the point that it's yellow, or white. When it gets to the point that it's yellow, golden color, that's when you should wait. Now it's dry enough that you should do it, but don't wait past that. Okay, don't wait till it gets fully dried out. Okay, so all of these people who I've just described to you, again, the Shulchan Aruch and the Chayyadim and Aruch HaShulchan are talking about that you should do the harvesting. What the Rashba is talking about is at stage BBCH 89, physiological maturity, when the grain is 20-25% moisture, and the grain is no longer green, and the stalks are starting to lose their green color, and at that point, if it would rain on it, it would become chametz. Now, I had mentioned beforehand that we have a little problem. What did the Rashba means when he said nisbashal lagamri or nisyabish lagamri? It didn't sound like he was describing something like these poskim are saying. So to answer that, to explain that, you have to turn to Avnei Nezer. And the Avnei Nezer is medayik that the Rashba didn't just say nisbashal lagamri. He didn't say nisyabish lagamri. The Rashba said was, in the words were, he said nisbashal lagamri b'mechubar, or nisyabish lagamri b'mechubar. He says, what's that word b'mechubar? Why does he keep? He said twice with each one of them when he said nisbashal lagamri b'mechubar, and why did he say nisyabish lagamri b'mechubar? Why did he say that? So the Avnei Nezer says the pshat is what's going on here is that it's dried out as much as it will be when it's attached. And it's in nisbash as much as it will be when it's attached. Meaning to say is, I don't care. I don't need it to be fully ripe, that it'll as ripe as it'll ever get, or as dry as it'll ever get. I need it to be as developed and dry as it needs to be when it's attached to the plant. Drying and development that could happen after it's attached, that's not relevant. So, in other words, the diak of this word b'mechubar that the Rashba says twice, by both of these things, is to tell you, I didn't mean fully dried out. I meant is as much as it has to be dried when it's attached, which again is our stage 89, when it's 20 to 25% moisture level. And as I just mentioned to you from the Chayadam and the Chashulchan and the Kiz Shulchan Aruch, they're all describing the same thing. So the one question we had was exactly how to fit into words of the Rashba, and the Avnei Nezer is helping us understand that. Okay, now, so we were standing at now at the end of our part one of this discussion is. Sure seems to us like everyone understands that what the Rashba is saying. When the Rashba says it can become chametz after a certain stage, he's describing this stage 89 when it's 20 to 25% moisture, and his point is harvest it then rather than waiting until it hits the 13-14% moisture, which is you might otherwise want to wait to harvest it at, or at least a modern farmer would want to wait to harvest it at. And I know, just throwing something else here, it sounds like I'm being very picky, like 13% moisture versus 20% moisture seems like very fine difference. So for people who live in the city, maybe that sounds like it's, you need fancy equipment for that, but farmers are very understand this. The people who work with this, for them, the difference in moisture is very perceptible and obvious to them who work with these grains all the time, and it's a very important factors for them. Okay, so now we're ending at part one. We were leaving at what it seems to us is what the Rashba said, the way everyone understands it. And in part two, we're going to talk about if that's actually what goes on. And the controversy about whether what I just described, which seems pretty clear what the Rashba means, the controversy about whether that's actually true and whether that's how grains, in fact, are harvested to make matzah for Pesach.